morning everyone, and welcome to the Museum of Sydney. I'm Caroline Butler-Bowden, and the head curator of the museum, and we're really delighted tonight because we're presenting the first collaboration between the Centre for Cultural Research at the University of Western Sydney and the Museum of Sydney. And we hope it's the beginning of many more, and indeed we're planning a new series or a new couple of events in February and March next year. And I'd particularly like to thank Professor David Rowe, who's the director of the centre, and Dr. James Avanatakis, who initially brought the two parties together following a Sydney Writers' Week event that we held together this year, and also the coordinator of the centre, Murray O'Neill, for seeing the potential in the partnership, and as I say, I hope it's the beginning of many more. And so now to the business of tonight, and I'd like to welcome Professor David Rowe. Thank you very much, and enjoy the evening.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for those kind words, Caroline. It's hopefully the beginning of a beautiful friendship. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming. And this inaugural event, I feel the weight of history pressing down on me as I speak. And I'm delighted to have Professor Toby Miller here to commence proceedings. I've known Toby for many years, and despite the fact that he's billed as the University of California, Riverside, he is an Australian, as well as a Brit, I think, and a green card carrier. But so he's an international figure who's written a formidable amount of really groundbreaking work in the whole area of the media and cultural studies, and across an astonishing range. We wrote a book together on globalization and sport with a couple of other people, but apart from sport, Toby's written an amazing book on global Hollywood, and he's written about the Avengers, for those of you who are fans of British television, cultural citizenship, cultural policy, a vast range of areas. And so I think he's particularly well qualified to talk about sport and the city tonight. And I'm also pleased to say that I have a distinguished panel with me to give an immediate response to Toby's talk, just something just to get the juices flowing, so to speak. And then we're going to open the floor for general discussion. The members of the panel are another international, well, two actually international visitors. Professor Gary Wannell from the University of Bedfordshire, United Kingdom, very well-known figure in the field of media and sport, and in particular his work on celebrity has been, his recent work in that area has been very influential. We have Dr. Liu Qing, who arrived a couple of days ago from the Communication University of China, and so has recently experienced the Beijing Olympics, and is doing some research in the area with us, and I'm sure we'll have some important reflections. And we also have a recent recruit to the University of Sydney, Professor Professor Stephanie Hemmerich-Donald, and she's a China scholar and a media studies scholar of some repute, and also I think we'll have some useful and important insights into the sorts of things that Toby has to say. After our discussion and debate, there is I'm not saying that won't be pleasurable, but there'll be even more pleasure afterwards, involving refreshments of both an alcoholic and non-alcoholic type, as well as some food. So I'd like to welcome to the stage Professor Toby Miller. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Thanks, everybody, for coming out tonight. And of course, much appreciation to the museum to the centre and to the University of Western Sydney as the parent of the centre, I guess. These partnerships between universities and other non-governmental institutions, whether they be quasi-private or quasi-public, are always a very good idea, I think, because after all, when you think of the history of university knowledge, particularly in Australia, much of it actually began and has been most effectively circulated in museums rather than in the more conventional classroom environment of the university, including, of course, even classroom environments in museums. It seems to me that we stand tonight in the shadow of what I think of as the greatest coming out party for a pariah of international politics since Japan celebrated its renewed industrial might and renewed governmental legitimacy at the Tokyo Olympics of 1964. Before that, of course, there was Berlin in 1936 and Leni Riefenstahl's sporting aesthetics, which still dominate, for any of you who've ever watched the Olympics on television, how athletics and swimming in particular are filmed today. It was all brought to you by the Nazis. We might also recall, when we think about the question of politics and the Olympics, the massacre at Tlatelolco 4 years after Tokyo, just 10 days before the beginning of the Mexico City Games, when Mexico was trying to show that it was post-authoritarian by shooting somewhere between 500 and 2,000 students who begged to differ. And we might also remember, just 4 years after that, Avery Brundage's tasteless refrain that the Games must go on after the murders at Munich in 1972. Well, these sporting events in Beijing have been going on seemingly without end. They are impossible to escape since the day before I turned 50. And they mark not only the new stature of the People's Republic as a legitimate state actor, but also its new status, a status which, of course, it is working assiduously to lose as quickly as possible, its new status as the world's furnace and foundry. Like the Soviet Union before it, China has shown that state socialist policies, combined with a huge gross domestic product, can be competitive, at least as applied to sport. So I'm aware of these shadows just as you are. However, unfortunately, given that I'm meant to be in some position of expertise, I actually stand before you uniquely underqualified to discuss these important topics by contrast with the other members of the panel assembled before me, who have high levels of expertise on China and the Olympics. I've never been to an Olympic Games. The closest I ever got was sitting in front of a TV in a bar in LA in 1984 with a former roommate who had fallen out with me. It was our one attempt at reconciliation. Total disaster. And I've never been to Beijing. Closest I got to Beijing was talking to women workers in southeastern China outside a barbed wire dormitory on the campus of a factory where they made photocopy machines. And on that occasion, it was their afternoon off a week. If I can contribute tonight, it will be through reference to general questions of urban regeneration, in addition to my historic role of ensuring a low tone to all proceedings with which I'm involved. The idea of regenerating cities takes its contemporary form from what we might call the Bilbao effect. Named after the strategy to remake that fallen city through the great symbolic gesture of a Frank Gehry building, in this case tipped on its side and inside a picture frame. The Bilbao effect refers to the notion that post-industrial life can flourish through spectacle, beauty, sport, and hipsters with money. And it's what informs things like the Beijing Olympics, the Athens Olympics, and other Olympics. I want to examine that assumption tonight in the context of the insistent cry that A, creative cities exist, and B, that they can be replicated everywhere. That 1,000 Bilbaos, at least 1,000 Bilbaos, can bloom. But first, let's look briefly at how this discourse functions on the ground in recent Olympic mythology and counters to it. In Beijing, apart from construction workers injured and killed refurbishing the city, apart from people forcibly removed from their homes, apart from horrendous levels of pollution, apart from intense repression of politics, apart from development that is designated for the wealthy and the athletic, not ordinary people, apart, in short, from what we saw in Athens and are about to see and are already seeing in London, we saw cuteness. That, I think, is the exemplification of cuteness. Just as in Athens, we saw newness blended with tradition, the Greeks finally allowed to reinvent themselves several thousand years on. So what could be finer? Well, here's how Ian Sinclair, writing in June of this year, sees the dream of Olympic regeneration. This is where he published his piece, as per the Bilbao effect. And I quote from Ian Sinclair, noted British novelist, travel writer, ethnographer. Early risers in the privilege of first-use recreation, the smudge of sun burning off the fog of pollution that hangs over a pre-Olympic city, fall into quiet conversation. Ice cream kiss of almond blossom, bridal abundance of cherry, pink and white, yellow pom-poms of japonica, horticultural cheerleaders. In a corner, under a high wall that gives away the previous identity of this public park as a decommissioned energy-generating plant, retired workers sway stiffly, slowly, in Tai Chi ballet. I'm fascinated by the elderly Chinese couple who circle every morning for more than an hour around the perimeter fence of the newly laid two-green carpet of the sports complex, achieved in advance of the great event. An outwash of generosity, a compensatory gesture for those who must endure years of drilling, dust, demolished schools and theatres, banishment from functioning but inconvenient housing developments, long-established businesses closed down, travellers expelled from edgeland settlements, allotment holders turned out. That's the end of the quotation. And Ian Sinclair was writing, of course, about London as it moves towards the 2012 Olympics, towards what the British government's grotesque, lapsed leftist lexicon has labelled as, and I quote, the primary strategic objective. And here's how some others have reacted against the Olympic Games, both this year and in the past. Some of it not very fair-minded, perhaps. Some of it rather blasphemous and unpleasant. Well, how does this fit with Bilbao? It fits thanks to this man, Ronald Reagan. The answer lies in the idea of creative cities and industries as enshrined in boosterish discourse and interventionist policy. The first country to adopt the neoliberal promises and premises of the creative industries was the United States. And I'm quoting here from Ronald Reagan's famous speech at the University of Southern California during his 1966 campaign, his first political campaign for the state governorship. Has anybody here not heard of Ronald Reagan? For those of you who don't remember him, this is what he looked like during his presidency of the country where I live, and this is what he looked like when he was a cute movie star and a lifeguard. In the mid-1960s, Reagan and other far-right reactionaries railed against Great Society liberalism, which promised an end to poverty and an end to discrimination through state action. They had, of course, their disastrous defeat just 2 years before that speech at the 1964 presidential elections, when Barry Goldwater was vanquished by Lyndon Baines Johnson. And that seemed to many to be the death rattle of the right in US politics. But it was soon followed by Reagan giving his speech at USC, aka the University of Spoiled Children, and that didn't result in, but was swiftly followed by his being elected governor, defeating, of course, Jerry Brown's father. The idea of a creative society, as per Reagan's words, a creative society as opposed to a great society. By the way, the genesis of the Great Society was in British Fabianism in the early part of the 20th century, around the time of the First World War. The British Fabians taught Walter Lippmann. Walter Lippmann, the great pioneering public sphere US journalist, started using the phrase. It was picked up by the Democratic Party on its liberal wing, then by Johnson. That idea of the creative society as opposed to a great society was central to the 1960s campaign rhetoric a rhetoric, of course, that birthed today's neoclassical, neoliberal idea of technology unlocking the creativity supposedly lurking, but in fact lacking, in individuals, permitting them to become happy and productive in ways that could and can elude both corporate and governmental dominance, and of course are also designed to discourage collective organisation. The US bought into Reagan's creative society, starting those 4 decades ago and really peaking in the period since 1980 and his election as president. Sport has become part of this discourse. It is both a sign and a method of national and urban revitalisation through a supposed creative class and its interests in leisure. But there is minimal proof of the existence of the creative class, and very few credible studies support the assertion that creative cities outperform their drab brethren economically. There is only minimal evidence of an overlap of tastes, values, living arrangements and locations between, say, artists, hurdlers and accountants, despite their being bundled together in the creative concept. Creative cities are basically creative ways of euphemising gentrification for the urban middle class, with the Olympics one more alibi among all too many for this shift in the political economy. The British Academy, the peak national body of the great and the good in the human sciences, notes that, and I quote, "Whereas the dominant global industries of the past focused on manufacturing, key corporations today, what are they involved in? Communications, information, entertainment, leisure." And US economic production in particular has adjusted away from a farming and manufacturing base to a cultural one. It now sells feelings, ideas, money, health, sports, laws, niche forms of identity, or culture. The trend is to harness the cultural skills of the population to replace lost employment in the primary and secondary sectors of the economy with jobs in music, theatre, animation, and selling fast food outside stadia. The US National Governors Association argues that innovative commercial businesses, non-profit institutions, and independent artists have become necessary ingredients in a successful region's habitat. Right across the nation, municipal, regional, and state funding agencies have dropped the old funding in administrative categories like sports and recreation or arts and crafts and replaced them with the discourse of the creative industries. The same thing is happening, of course, in Europe, in Latin America, in Africa, and in Asia. 2 years ago, Rwanda convened a global conference on the creative economy to take the social healing supposedly engendered by culture and commodify it. Brazil hosts the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, and the UN Development Programme's International Forum for Creative Industries. Even India's venerable last gasp of Nehruvianism, its planning commission, has a committee for creative industries. And China wants to stop making dog food and Xerox machines and start developing new pharmaceuticals and TV shows. All these places are enthralled to the idea that culture is an endlessly growing resource. In UNCTAD's words, that creativity, more than labour, more than capital, more even than traditional technologies, is deeply embedded in every country's context. And of course, the dream of creativity offers a glowingly profitable afterlife in a little thing called intellectual property, hence the preference for TV programs and pharmaceuticals over dog food and Xerox machines. Many of these manoeuvres are enthralled to the US $40,000 a lecture Professor Richard Florida. He's the one on the right rather than the middle. Seen here on a consultancy trip to the creative city of Sydney. Professor Florida and his business school acolytes remorselessly and unfailingly identify a creative class that they claim is revitalising post-industrial towns through a magic elixir of tolerance, technology and talent, as measured by same-sex households, broadband connections and graduate degrees. True believers in this putative liberation from corporate domination and cultural uniformity through the touching mythology of Schumpeterian small business and universal individual genius, argue for an efflorescence of the creative sector via technology and entrepreneurialism. A new world supposedly does many fantastic things. It makes consumers into producers, it frees the disabled from confinement, it encourages new subjectivities, it rewards intellect and competitiveness, it links people across cultures, and yes, it allows billions of flowers to bloom in a post-political cornucopia. It's a kind of Marxist Godardian wet dream, where people fish, film, frolic, and finance from morning to midnight. The mass scale of the culture industries is progressively overrun by the individual talent of the creative sector, as exemplified last month by David Beckham, Jimmy Page, and a supporting cast falling on and off a London bus with umbrellas in their hands and Beijing Krieg lights shedding their shadows. The creative industry consultants who deliver such messages and massages of renewal have become branded celebrities, like Dude, descending on welcoming burgers, eager to be made over at public expense by professors whose books appear on airport newsstands rather than cloistered scholarly shelves. There are three major tendencies among these messengers of happiness. Richard Floridians ride around town on their bicycles to spy on ballet-loving, gay-friendly, multicultural computer geeks who have moved to deindustrialised freezing rust belts. Secondly, true believer Brisbane creationists announce that man is evolving towards an open economy and an open society, as evidenced by the number of millionaires owning sports teams who are more than 10 years younger than me. And thirdly, Brussels bureaucrats offer blueprints to cities eager to be made over by culture and tolerance in search of affluence. Each tendency offers a makeover from the rusty coinage of the past, courtesy of the newly minted creative sector. But today's discourse of creativity ignores such critical issues as high-tech pollution and the precariat. For instance, the high technology, service and cultural industries of the new economy, everything from computers to golf courses, supposedly represent clean business. In this country, for example, the Australian Council for the Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences refers to the new post-smokestack era of industry, a post-manufacturing utopia for workers, consumers and residents, because there are residues of code, not residues of carbon. But if you go through the Political Economy Research Institute's Misfortune 100 top corporate polluters in the US, you find media owners at numbers 1, 3, 16, 22 and 39. Why? Because media production relies on the exorbitant water use of computer technology, while making semiconductors requires the use of hazardous chemicals, including many known carcinogens. Waste from discarded electronics is one of the biggest sources of heavy metals and toxic pollutants in the world's trash piles. And let's not talk about what happens when you incinerate them. The accumulation of electronic hardware causes grave environmental and health concerns, stemming from the potential seepage of noxious chemicals, gases and metals into landfills, water sources and electronic waste salvage yards. Much e-cycling is done by preteen girls who pick away without protection at discarded first world televisions and computers. The vast majority of them live in China, India and Brazil. This is an ugly face of the creative sector. And we see another one in the situation of what I mentioned earlier, the so-called creative class, which we might rename as the cognitariat, those with high academic qualifications and no job security. Such conditions inside, for example, the electronic games sector represent a key switching point in an hourglass economy. In this precariat, jobs are part-time and they're multiple. Risk is intense and disparities in income are extreme. Olympian statistics, which orbit halo-like around creative industry policy, simply do not measure such things, either the pollution issues of the new industries or the cognitariat, precariat riskiness. As I noted earlier, the first country to adopt neoliberal creative industries discourse was the United States via Reagan's Creative Society, starting 4 decades ago and providing today's best-selling pop academic tomes. So what's been the outcome of the most fully evolved fantasy alive about small business and everyday creativity as motors of economic growth that must function unencumbered by regulation and unencumbered by public investment and democracy? Take your pick in the US, from crumbling bridges, dangerous freeways, dysfunctional levees, 3 million people homeless, inadequate schooling, an electricity grid that barely functions, 50 million people without health care, and politics run essentially by pharmaceutical firms, health insurance, tort law, finance capital, oil corporations, arms manufacturers, tobacco companies, and gun owners. No doubt all of them operate very creatively. Then, of course, there is the question, the awkward one for the many burghers around the world who hire this guy, of defining what they mean by creativity. UNESCO's Global Alliance for Cultural Diversity heralds creative industries as a portmanteau term that covers the cultural sector but goes further, beyond output and into that favourite neoliberal canard process. But the claim that what is made in a sector of the economy does not characterise that sector, that creativity is not just one input into making stuff, but in fact the defining quality of an industry, is misleading. This bizarre shift in adjectival meaning makes it possible for anything profitable to be catalogued under creative. The term lacks precision, it just doesn't work. A boosterist sleight of hand places culture and leisure at the centre of economic innovation. How? By pretending that creativity encompasses, for example, corporate and governmental information technology, which is where real money is made and real power is exercised, and not, by small business entrepreneurs or the sports sector. It's obvious to all of us that big firms rarely innovate, all the studies indicate that, but it's inaccurate to regard that fact as a shift in the centre of gravity. The cultural industries remain under the control of media conglomerates and communication firms. Who owns Last.fm? Who owns MySpace.com? Viacom and News Corporation. Which websites are most read around the world for news? The websites of TV networks and wire services. We must ask whether creative industries discourse amounts to recycling material created by the grassroots genius, exploiting their intellectual property, and generating a standardised business sector that excludes and even distorts its very source of business. And I'm quoting there from the Hindu newspaper. There is minimal proof for the existence of a creative class, or that creative cities outperform their drab brethren economically. Companies do seek skills when deciding where to locate their businesses, but skills also seek work. City centres only attract those who are young and not yet breeding. The supposed centrality of gay culture in the Floridian calculus derives from assuming that same-sex households are queer, but university dorms and sorority and fraternity houses are not quite there. Even if this were accurate, again with the US always as its model, many successful cities in the US are amongst the most reactionary in the Western world. Consider Houston, Orlando, or Phoenix. Not a lot of tolerance there. The idea of urbanism incipient in US demographic statistics includes the suburbs, which now of course hold more residents than most cities do, and so that too is a suspect figure in terms of the importance of downtown lofts to economies. There is no evidence of an overlap of tastes, values, living arrangements and locations between the groups that I mentioned before, the hurdlers, the artists and the accountants. And what the US has going for it, unlike most other big cities in the world, is that the middle class has massive internal migration. People who grow up in one place, get educated in another, and then travel all over the country all the time. Finally, other surveys pour scorn on the claim that quality of life is central to selecting business campuses, as opposed to low costs, good communications technology, proximity to markets, and adequate transportation. A European Commission evaluation of 29 cities of culture disclosed that their principal goal, which was to stimulate economic growth by the public subvention of culture to renew failed cities, had itself failed. Glasgow, for instance, was initially hailed as a success of this programme, but many years after the rhetoric, there has been no sustained growth. This year, Liverpool, astonishingly, became an official city of culture, having allocated hundreds of millions of pounds in public funds to an arts programme, a museum, galleries, a convention centre, a retail outlet, renewed transportation, a rebuilt waterfront, and every good thing. This was premised on regeneration through culture, but sceptics asked, is that a foundation strong enough to sustain a lasting economy, or is it pyramid selling? In their desperate search to win this title, the title in this case of European City of Culture, bureaucrats and consultants make desperate claims to distinguish their cities creatively. So for instance, Bristol in Britain lays claim to Cary Grant as a native son. And here's a picture of Cary Grant climbing down to Bristol as quickly as he possibly could. They do this even as the data for London illustrate that the creative industries rely on the health of the finance sector. upshot of creative industries discourse is that market objectives have overdetermined cultural and democratically accountable ones. Creative cities, as I said, are creative ways of euphemising gentrification for the urban middle class. So what should be done? There are signs of hope. Not everybody believes the man on the bicycle who likes ballet and is depicted in the surfboard. Kulturmacht Europa has issued a sterling declaration after its Federal Congress on Cultural Policy about protecting cultural workers and consumers, as well as proprietors, under copyright and other laws, and ensuring diverse cultural texturality and infrastructure. If you look at the Jodhpur initiative for promoting cultural industries in the Asia-Pacific, adopted and signed by 28 countries, you see a similar concern for the creative industries discourse and its failings and its attempt to monetize and marketize all and sundry. We need, it seems to me today, a politics that is not enthralled to capital, not enthralled to creationism, not enthralled to consultants, because otherwise we are left with Billy Bragg's lament in one of his famous songs for the displacement of the great and the good by the greedy and the mean in what he called england.co.uk. Now obviously, in its folkloric arts and crafts, wine, cheese and trees manifestation, critical engagements with policy can appear dilettantish and even dull. What can such engagements offer alongside Olympian promises, technological enthusiasm, the cult of youth, fever for branding, the fever for monetization, the ceaseless organizational change, the sense of churn as improvement? What can that be countered with? What could be a contradictory appeal next to the promise of newly green cities, the latest in leisure facilities, the global attention of the media for 2 or 4 weeks, the fast food being sold on street corners outside stadia, the floodlights illuminating summer nights as happy, for example, smiling Sydneysiders greet Olympic tourists and one another? Well, here's my hope, that in concert with social movements, critical policy activists and analysts can resist the dislocation, corruption, malfeasance, incompetence, xenophobia and political absurdities that accompany Olympic bids. Come on down Salt Lake City and claim your prize as the most corrupt winner. I hope that civic-minded folks can resist the utopic mythology of creative industries discourse and sporting boosterism. Our model and inspiration must be social movement struggle, not corporate welfare. Migrant workers, not creationists. Displaced denizens, not Floridians. Otherwise, we are likely to be left yet again with economic disaster. Consider Montreal, which took 30 years to pay off the price of holding the Summer Olympics through tax increases, through cuts in essential services, and through budgetary austerity. Consider Athens, which saw the budget for the Games balloon from $1.3 billion to $14.2 billion. Consider Barcelona, often touted as the one financial triumph, but whose economy shrank after the Games. And even that only shrank to the extent it did because there had already been arranged a whole succession of major international congresses in the space that had been redeveloped for the purposes of the 1992 Olympiad. Or for that matter, consider what is obviously an incomplete project, namely Beijing, incomplete in the sense that it's much too early to know what the cost-benefit analysis should be, but it certainly didn't attract anywhere near the tourism that was hoped for, and we don't know anything even approximating to the reality of its Olympic budget. And of course, every time we think about the boosterism of the Olympics, we are likely to encounter the human rights disasters that corrupt virtually every Olympic Games, whether in China or anywhere else, because virtual martial law is routinely imposed by governments these days for the duration of such events. The Charter of the International Olympic Committee, the body that has carriage of the Olympics, provides that it must, and I quote, promote a positive legacy from the Olympic Games to the host cities, unquote. That doesn't sound to me like the legacy experienced by thousands of migrant workers who rebuilt Beijing for 2008, many of whom didn't receive payments and didn't receive adequate health care. It doesn't sound like the legacy available to folks who were displaced from their homes, who will never have access to the gentrified leisure facilities built in their name and in their stead. And you could say similar things about endless other Olympic sites. So we must ensure, those of us who are concerned about what the picture that I at least am outlining, that the IOC sticks to its charter, that it argues for a fair and a safe construction life in the erection of new facilities, and a democratic and populist afterlife to these facilities once they have been finished. Otherwise, it seems to me, we are as blameworthy as the plutocrats, planners, politicians and pundits who pop up with each new sports proposal to peddle their putrid pabulum. If we don't intervene, we risk being silent boosters of what Ian Sinclair rightly describes, to go back to his earlier criticism, what Ian Sinclair rightly describes in the London Review of Books as a tsunami of speculative capital, wanton destruction, hole digging, the throwing up of apartment blocks, dormitory hives, warehouse conversions among murky waterways. Of course, resistance can appear futile, and it sometimes seems as though ordinary people lose every time in the struggle against new developments. And needless to say, in the case of the Olympics, in themselves a populist creature, there are many ordinary people, many people in this room, many people inside me, who love the Olympics and are totally jazzed by it. After all, those wishing to resist are against Olympian odds in this grandiose quadrennial scam of all scams. But we mustn't stop trying to negate the next wasted cycle of demolish, then dig, then design. As we speak, the city as a site of refuge, as Jacques Derrida calls it, the city as a guarantor of anonymity, as George Simmel called it, these are being displaced by the city as a mall, as Frank Lowy might describe it, and the city as a massacre, as happened in Mexico in Tlatelolco 40 years ago. Can't we do better by drawing inspiration and direction from the endless public policy studies that show how flawed Olympic urban regeneration is? Can't we do better by listening to the local residents who resist it? And can't we do better by pointing out and trying to close the gap between what Olympism promises and delivers? I think we can.